Welcome. My name is Holly. I'm a manager here at Edison Ford Winter Estates. Each month, I do a digital discussion on a topic of historic interest, U.S. history. And this month, it's on Lincoln at Gettysburg. And you probably have gathered that I'm a Lincoln admirer. And I'm very excited about presenting this. My husband and I were at Gettysburg about a month ago. We've Most years we go at once a year because there's always something new to discover. And when I was there, I saw all the things about Lincoln and I thought this would be a great topic. And by the way, Thomas Edison was 16 years old at this time. So I'm sure he heard about the Gettysburg Address. He used to sell newspapers on a train. So that's how I'm tying it into him. But anyway, I'll be honest with you. I am a great Lincoln admirer. So there's probably not going to be a lot of criticism about him, and certainly not about his speech. Lincoln at Gettysburg, and this is one of the pictures where they're trying to gather to try to recreate what it might have looked like when Lincoln was speaking. But anything to do with Lincoln, quoting him, um, saying where he stood, what the platform was like, where was the speaker's platform. There's so much controversy, historic, but I guess it keeps our mind sharp. So I'll do my best to give you what I perceive to be the accurate description of what happened. Why is Lincoln even going to Gettysburg? Well, there had been a battle there, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and not just any battle, the bloodiest battle of the Civil War with more fatalities, and that actually happens on the second day. And you want to know something? I've never actually done a presentation just on Gettysburg. Maybe I will someday, but it was horrific. And over 50,000 casualties, meaning I think it's about 53. My husband's probably saying, no, I know exactly what it is. But there were a lot of casualties. The casualties meaning killed, wounded, missing. And for the town of Gettysburg, it left them with many dead bodies to bury, as well as horses, among other things. And when all the troops had left, they were left to pick up the pieces. This is one of the women that pick up the pieces, and this is just to set the stage so that you know why Lincoln is coming there. This is Elizabeth Thorne, and her statue is in Evergreen Cemetery, which is the cemetery where civilians were buried. But if I tell you about this, it said Elizabeth Masser Thorne, she and her husband had immigrated from Germany, and they became the first family to live in a gatehouse. It's very iconic, made of brick at the Evergreen Cemetery, because Peter was appointed superintendent of the cemetery in 1856. And after Peter joined the Union Army, Elizabeth assumed his duties and served as caretaker from 62 to 65. With the help of her elderly father, amid the heat and stench, Elizabeth buried 91 soldiers in the weeks following the Battle of Gettysburg in Evergreen Cemetery. While 6 months pregnant, she dug the graves in one of the rockiest regions of the cemetery. And some of the soldiers are buried on the battlefield, but they will be moved. Union soldiers will be moved to someplace else, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. And Confederate soldiers, most of them were shipped south, many of them in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. This is just setting the stage for about Lincoln coming. Okay, here we go. 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg took a toll on both armies. After the battle, bodies were scattered throughout Gettysburg. The dead were quickly buried in shallow graves on the battlefield, and they were identified in writing by pencil on wooden boards, and you can gather that that won't last long. As the week passed, rain and wind eroded the graves, and this caused the Gettysburg citizens to call for the creation of a soldiers' cemetery for the proper burial of the federal dead. So not just in the private cemetery and not on the battlefield, but a cemetery to honor them. The site chose the hill from which the federal center repulsed Pickett's charge during the battle. The reburial process began on October 27, 1863, and it ended in 1869 when the Soldiers' National Monument was dedicated. And this cemetery's name will change because it's today, I believe, it's Gettysburg National Cemetery. And here we have the figures, the Union, 23,049, the Confederate, 28,063. And I have here 3,155 killed and Confederate 3,903 killed. And then you can see the missing. But there's other places, this comes to roughly 7,000, but there's other places where I found up to 10,000. So just picture that there were a lot of dead. And I visit a lot of the areas of the cemetery, but this is where some of the men from New Hampshire that they actually identified were buried. And sometimes you'll actually have somebody misidentified and they're not really from New Hampshire. And this is for the ones that they didn't even know their names. They just knew based on where they were found that they were 49 bodies. So this is in the aftermath of the battlefield. I believe this is called stereoptic. You could look in it to give it a 3D effect. And this is at, I believe this is in Rose Woods, and they're laying there, the dead. And that happened many places for several days. The dead bodies would lay there. And this is them preparing the bodies for burial. Some of them have been dug up and they're going to be reburied. Can you imagine being in Gettysburg during that time when this all happened? And your town just happened to be a place where there were a lot of roads and some people thought it would be a good place to start a battle. It wasn't supposed to happen there, but it did. And it changed their lives forever. And I would urge you, if you have never been to Gettysburg, please take the opportunity to go. And this is a cemetery, and I did take this picture when we were there a couple of years ago. It said landscape architect William Saunders designed the cemetery as a wide semicircle radiating from a central point to be decorated with a grand monument. And that's what you can see in the back there. You can see a monument, the soldiers' monument in the middle there. And the sections were divided by states, and smaller states closest to the monument and larger states along the outer portions. Reinterments and continued through March of 1864, and the Soldiers' National Monument in the center, the circle, was dedicated on July 1st, 1869. Numerous other monuments dot the cemetery's landscape, including a memorial to the soldiers of New York and a monument to President Lincoln. By 1872, construction of the cemetery was complete and the administration of the National Cemetery transferred to the federal government. And that's from the National Park Service website, because I wanted to make sure I got this right. And they do presentations in there lots of times. Sometimes they talk about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address when it's open with so that people can have park rangers to speak with. Sometimes they talk about death in the cemetery. There are witness trees there that witness the battle or witness what happened to the soldiers. And there's the monument we talk about. And November 19th, which isn't that far away, commemorates the anniversary of the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, today known as the Gettysburg National Cemetery. It is also known as the site of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. But once we get into this, you'll find that nothing is without controversy here. Delivered at the cemetery's dedication ceremonies 4.5 months after the battle. And every number is kind of vague and open to interpretation, I guess. So I've read 15, I've read 20. So between 15 and 20,000 visitors came to Gettysburg for this dedication of the cemetery, which had 2,400 residents before the war. Dedication, here it's called Consecration Cemetery. Sometimes it's called Remembrance Ceremony. They wanted to be part of history. Most of the people were from southern and central Pennsylvania, which makes sense. And the rest had to rely on public transportation, which could be quite arduous. It wasn't like you're hopping in an Uber or taking a plane or going in a taxi or by train. The normal railroad bridge, which was destroyed during the Battle of Gettysburg, requiring a workaround to cross the Susquehanna River. From November 16th to November 19th, the railroad and the town were overwhelmed. I mean, they did not have a ton of places for people to stay, not a lot of hotels. Gettysburg was packed with people looking to find lodging, and people were staying in barns, churches, sheds, in addition to homes and hotels. Some people laid on the sidewalk, street. It was really rough, and this is kind of a picture of people heading toward to that ceremony that day, but I thought it kind of indicated how busy it was as well. On November 2nd, President Abraham Lincoln, now remember this is going to take place on the 19th, so 17 days before, the President of the United States received a letter from Judge David Wills, a friend of Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin. Wills believed that something permanent and dignified need to be done for the thousands of bodies of the deceased Union soldiers from the Battle of Gettysburg in July. Due to the high cost of transferring thousands of bodies hundreds of miles away, most families could not afford to bring home their family members. Wills had made sure that the unused land next to Evergreen Cemetery on Cemetery Hill was set aside to inter the dead from the battle. But why are we waiting till this last minute to invite the president? Well, you'll find out. It might surprise you. And by the way, I didn't tell you what I was sitting in front of. This is in front of the museum, the Gettysburg National Museum. In 2008, that was built. The old one was so much smaller, and they put this statue of Lincoln. And this was this year. I took a picture of him. It was kind of misty out, and I thought he looked kind of mournful. I'll show you another picture of it later, but it just touched me when I saw him looking over there, sitting there. All right, so here's the letter he gets. Sir, the several states having soldiers in the Army of the Potomac who were killed at the Battle of Gettysburg or have since died at various hospitals which are established in the vicinity have procured grounds on a prominent part of the battlefield for a cemetery and are having the dead removed to them and properly buried. These grounds will be consecrated and set apart for this sacred purpose by appropriate ceremonies on Thursday, the 19th. Honorable Edward Everett will deliver the oration, and I'll tell you who he was. I am authorized by the governors of the different states to invite you to be present and participate in these ceremonies, which will doubtless be imposing and solemnly impressive. It is the desire that after the oration, you, as chief executive of the nation, formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use by a few appropriate remarks. It'll be a great source of great gratification to the many widows and orphans who have been made almost friendless by the great battle here, to have you here personally, and it will kindle anew in the breast of comrades of the brave dead who are now in the tented field or nobly meeting the foe in the front, a confidence that they who sleep in death on the battlefield, and by the way, they spelled it as two words at the time, are not forgotten by those in highest authority, and they will feel that should their fate be the same, their remains will not be uncared for. We hope that you will be able to be present to perform this last solemn act to the soldiers dead on this battlefield. I, with them, great respect, your I am embarrassed. Excellencies, I couldn't speak today. Obedient servant, David Willis, agent for Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania and acting for all states. And that's the copy of the handwritten letter that Lincoln got. That's now in the Library of Congress. Well, Edward Everett was noted as a great orator, and he is going to be the centerpiece of them talking. And there's so many roles. He had run for vice president. He had been an ambassador, I believe it was, to England. He had been a professor at Harvard. He had been a governor. He had been president of Harvard briefly, and he's just well known for being a great speaker. So what is Lincoln going to say? 17 days before, he's going to say yes. President Lincoln knew he was not the keynote speaker. Everett had already been chosen before Lincoln was invited. So he immediately accepted. For the next 2 weeks, he wrote down some of his thoughts. When he boarded the train for Gettysburg on Wednesday, November 18th, his remarks were not finished. And that is the Gettys sign that's there today at the Gettysburg railway station. And he wants to go. because he wants an opportunity to speak about what's happening in the war. I mean, the war has been pretty controversial, and he needs an opportunity to speak and kind of say what his vision was. So he jumped at the opportunity, even though he's only invited 17 days before. And there's all kinds of myths that he wrote this on the train. He did not write it on the train. I never want to be too bumpy. He had a good part of it written, but it wasn't completely finished. Lincoln's Washington Gettysburg journey began at 12:10 on November 18th, 1863, when the president and those in his party boarded a decorated, just a 4-car railroad train to Baltimore and Ohio. It's Baltimore and Ohio special train, but it was pretty small. The train headed north to Baltimore's Camden Station, which I'm assuming is where Camden Yards Ballpark is today, arriving at 1:20. A team of horses then pulled the train through the city streets to reach the Bolton Station, which was the depot of the North Central Air Railway. By the way, the last time Lincoln went through Baltimore as he's going to his inauguration, remember, some of those people were Southerners. It was kind of divided state. They were throwing things at him. They were trying to kind of hide Lincoln at that time. A baggage car was added as the train departed at 2 p.m., and the train arrived at Hanover Junction, 46 miles north of Baltimore, where it was supposed to meet a train from Harrisburg, which is the capital of PA, carrying Governor Andrew Curtin, but the governor's train was delayed. So Lincoln's train switched tracks to the Hanover branch and Gettysburg lines, turning west to go the last 20 miles to Gettysburg. After 13 miles, the train reached Hanover at 5 p.m., where the train paused for a few minutes to await the passage of an eastbound train. Lincoln stepped out onto the open platform. A crowd of curious citizens had gathered. Well, you had the rebels here last summer, the president observed to the crowd. Did you fight them any? Confederate soldiers had skirmished with Union troops in the skirmish at the Battle of Hanover, which you probably never heard of. It's not well known, a prelude to the Battle of Gettysburg. That began the next day. I trust when the enemy was here, the citizens of Hanover were loyal to our country and the Stars and Stripes. If you are not all true patriots in support of the Union, he should be, he told them. As he turned to board the train, Lincoln showed his sense of humor. Well, you have seen me, he said, and according to general experience, you have seen less than you expected to see. When the train arrived in Gettysburg at 6:30, it's actually anywhere between 6 and 6:30, coffins were still stacked on the platform of the brick station. The Battle of Gettysburg had resulted in more than 51,000 casualties, but not that many burials. Reburying the last of the thousands of Union and Confederate soldiers was still underway. But as I remind you, the Confederates will not remain there. And that is the way the railway station looks since it's been restored. And I believe that is owned by the National Park Service today. Lincoln most likely began to write his appropriate remarks before he left Washington because the president's busy schedule gave him little time to write after he arrived. He and his entourage were escorted to the Wills house and met with David Wills, the man that invited him, to discuss last-minute details of the ceremony, while a crowd in the town square, sometimes called the town diamond, serenaded him. And it's not far at all to get to the Wills house from the train station, singing, "We are coming, Father Abraham." The following brisk and overcast morning, John Nicolay, one of his secretaries, entered the president's room to find Lincoln adding the finishing touches to his address. And this is a picture of the Wills house. Today, sadly, when I first visited Gettysburg, it was owned privately, and it was just the second floor that was open, and it was a little kitschy. They had like the Gettysburg Address made out of macaroni letters, things like that. But then it was purchased by the National Park Service. It became open. I got to go to it once where the whole thing was open downstairs and upstairs. And I took some pictures in 2016 of it. It is not open right now, and I will explain. And there's a sign just showing it that it's owned by the National Park Service. And there's another sign that says Wills House. Abraham Lincoln was a guest of David Wills In this house, November 18th and 19th, 1863, here he met Governor Curtin and others, greeted the public, and completed his Gettysburg Address. And off of that is probably not, I don't think they call it a rotary, maybe a traffic circle. There's so many roads there, which is one of the reasons why the battle took place there. The Wills House. Abraham Lincoln slept in this house November 18th, 1863, the night before his immortal address at the cemetery erected by the Gettysburg Camp 112 Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, November 19th, 1926. Excuse me. Here's an interesting statue outside the Wills House. The Lincoln statue at the Wills House. Just outside the Wills House, you can see a highly realistic image of President Lincoln greeting a modern-day visitor. I think this is from 1991 or something like that. This life-size bronze statue called The Return Visit is the work of J. Seward Johnson. The Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania placed it here in 1991, okay? It depicts Lincoln pointing to the house as if he's explaining where he completed his Gettysburg Address. On the night Lincoln stayed here, a New York Tribune reporter wrote, after supper, the president was serenaded by the excellent band of the 5th New York Artillery. After repeated calls, Mr. Lincoln at length presented himself where he was loudly cheered. Lincoln, however, wisely declined to make a speech. Some other people will say that he said a few words saying he's not going to make a speech. And I took this from Abraham Lincoln Online, and it's to relate with Gettysburg. And this is a nice part. The battlefield is down a little further, but it is a nice part of the city to visit because Lincoln stayed here. There's all kinds of signage, and there's so many things that mention Lincoln's name. There's a Lincoln Hotel. Well, I'll tell you more later. And this is when the Wills House was open. And I'll tell you briefly why. Well, I know right now we have the government shutdown, but it's been closed since October of 2024 when a pipe burst and damaged it. And I know you'd think the federal government would have that restored right away, but they didn't. And I know sometimes it's money issues that cause that, but it's a shame because it's such a historic place to visit. The Wills House was among the largest in town. And I took some pictures of signs, never knowing I was going to do this presentation, but I'm a nerd, so that's why I did it. But on November 18th, it overflowed with dinner guests, 38 in all. Edward Everett, the man that's going to speak, the French minister to Washington, Governor Curtin, and other dignitaries were here. Mrs. Wills had also prepared several bedrooms for overnight guests, and everyone was full, including her own. That was given to the president. Along with each came aides and guards necessary to ensure their safety and comfort. The Wills family, like many Victorian households, employed a serving staff to help with the chores required to keep a large family comfortable. During the dinner, Mrs. Wills glanced up to see the cook peeking out from behind the kitchen door to catch a glimpse of Lincoln and other famous visitors. Hosting such distinguished guests, let alone a president, was a once-in-a-lifetime experience for everyone involved. And after the dinner, the guests retired to the parlor and they talked and amused the Wills children until Lincoln and the other overnight guests retired to their rooms. And while Lincoln declined to give a proper speech at the Wills House on the night of November 18th, guess who was ready? Secretary of State Seward. If you've ever read the book Team of Rivals, he's one of Lincoln's rivals. And supposedly they became very good friends. His probably the one he was closest to. And a lengthy oration at the neighboring Harper House, and they were actually joined. Seward proclaimed slavery to be the cause of the Civil War and said that its abolishment should be the war's aim. The end of his speech foreshadowed Lincoln's address the next day. This government of ours, the purest, the best, and the wisest, and the happiest in the world must be, and so far as we are concerned, practically will be immortal. Lincoln wrote portions of the Gettysburg Address before he left Washington, but finished writing in the room you were about to enter. You're not entering it, but you can see the picture I took of it. After carefully reworking the address and gaining details about the consecration ceremony from Wills, Lincoln walked next door, his speech in hand, to visit with Secretary of State Seward. He returned within a half an hour and retired to the bedroom. The next morning, he made final revisions. And that Will said between 9 and 10 o'clock, the president sent a servant to request me to come to his room. I went and found him with paper prepared to write, and he said that he had just seated himself to put up on paper a few thoughts for tomorrow's exercises and had sent for me to ascertain what part he was to take in them and what was expected of him. After a full talk on the subject, I left him. And I don't know if I put this in here, and I'm afraid I might have forgotten. So I wanted to say that Lincoln there's a couple things going on here. His son had been very ill. He has already lost one son. Actually, they lost two, but since he was in the White House, he lost one child. And now he has another child sick, and it gets a telegram saying that his son is doing better, and he is so relieved. They couldn't bear to lose another child. And as again, I said, 15, maybe 20,000 people that came to Gettysburg, and it's only 2,400 people. The crowd was so big, the Adams County Sentinel reported that every available spot on the principal streets was occupied. Lincoln was up early, and a young woman who lived a block from the Wills house went to the square to see the gathering crowd. And looking up at the Wills house, she could see Lincoln walking in his room as though engaged in deep thought. Both Lincoln and Everett, the keynote speaker, wanted to see the battlefield, but they went in different directions. Everett, with several men from Massachusetts, where he was from, took a walk around the borders of the battlefield, but Lincoln borrowed a springless buckboard and with Seward headed to see some of the first day's battle, where Major General John Reynolds had given his life to preserve the Union. And that was taken in a couple of years ago, I believe, when we visited it. We visit Major Reynolds where he was shot a lot. There are two statues of him there at Gettysburg as well. One of him on a horse. I think one is in this other one's cemetery. And then if you go to the Lancaster Cemetery, you can also see where he's buried. When he returned to the Wills house, Lincoln dressed for the ceremony and then went down to breakfast, where he requested a cup of tea. He left the table about 9 o'clock and returned to his room, where he sat with his speech, and his visit to battlefield might have caused him to modify a few remarks. His John Nicolay, his secretary, found Lincoln at his desk, and Lamon, and he's well known as he's the marshal of this to organize it, but he's also Lincoln's bodyguard. And yes, he's the person that left the door to the president's box unguarded. And he actually annoyed some people very much. He spent much of the evening before discussing roles and responsibilities with his marshals and was ready at sunrise. Lamon could not know his timetable would not last due to the size of the crowd. It made it very difficult even to get to the cemetery, but because everyone marched to the cemetery, it would begin later. Lincoln left the Wills house just before 10 o'clock, wearing his usual Prince Albert coat and stovepipe hat, wrapped in a mourning band. That's to mourn his dead son, but on that day it was also for the thousands who had died in battle. He carried white riding gloves as he headed to the street and as a waiting horse. Getting to his horse proved to be more difficult than Lincoln or Lamon anticipated, as the crowd surged forward as he emerged from the Wills house, surrounding him, asking him for handshakes, touching his clothing, and cheering his presence. Lamon, with the help of some of his marshals, interceded and helped Lincoln push through the horde, and he mounted his horse, but the crowd again surged forward. And I have to tell you that everybody talks about, some people said he was on such a tiny horse that his feet dragged. There's all kinds of stories about the horse, but honestly, I think that it would have made the paper if that were true. Here's another of the roads on the way to the cemetery. Lincoln was then, because that's the Wills house right there, joined by cabinet members who would ride with him. The marshal's most challenging task was assembling the citizens from the 18 states that lost sons in the battle. Some didn't march, but watched along the parade route or arrived in front of the ceremonial platform well ahead of the procession to have a good place. Leading the procession down Baltimore Street, the Marine Band followed military units. The 2nd United States Artillery followed the band, and then the U.S. Regular Cavalry, so part of the regular army, on horseback. General Couch and his staff, and the president and his entourage, and David Wills organized the staff agents, and Governor Curtin took care of the dozen current, past, or recently elected governors. The head of the procession reached the platform about 11:15, though others say it was closer to noon. Lincoln and the rest of the distinguished guests dismounted and climbed the steps to the 3-foot-high platform at the left front of the stage. And there's a sign before the cemetery there, the military cemetery, and you have to park a little ways away and then walk across the street. And it says nearby, November 19th, 1863, in dedicating the National Cemetery, Abraham Lincoln gave the address which he had written in Washington and revised after his arrival in Gettysburg on the evening of November 18th. So you go into the military cemetery, and then off to your right is this, but it's not the right location. Close, but not the right location. A bust of Lincoln, and then the Gettysburg Address there. So here is part of the cemetery, and that's the military cemetery. And you can see on the other side is the Evergreen Cemetery. And here's the controversy. The marker is in the military cemetery. Most people have believed that he was actually in Evergreen Cemetery, that the platform was when he gave the Gettysburg Address. But I'll get to that some more in a little bit. But tradition holds that it's on the other side of that fence, a little ways in. And this says, this monument commemorates Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, November 19th, 1863. The address was delivered about 300 yards from this spot along the Upper Cemetery Drive. The site is now marked by the Soldiers' National Monument, and it was dedicated on January 24th, 1912, and it tells you the sculptor is Henry Bush Brown. Okay, this photograph taken on the day of the Gettysburg Address is supposed to rule out the Soldiers' National Monument as the location for the speaker's platform the day of the address. So over there on the left, you see the flagpole at future location of the Soldiers' National Monument. There's the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse. You can see where it says the speaker's platform will be. Comfort station. That sounds like it would be a bathroom, but it is actually a place for Everett to have time to, go in, chill, unwind, whatever he needed to do. And there's the peak of Culp's Hill, where a lot of the first day's battle took place. And this is from the Library of Congress. Alexander Gardner, or one of his photographers, took that picture. Now, you can't even believe, we haven't even gotten to the speech yet, and we've got controversy, because you see where that red arrow is, and that's supposed to be a bareheaded Lincoln, though originally it was supposed to have had his hat on. In the crowd, that's the only picture of Lincoln, they say, that takes place, and that there's only like 6 photographs taken from that day, the only one that includes Lincoln, right? That's the traditional view. This was discovered. Abraham Lincoln, and there he is again. I think you could probably spot him to the left of the man with the big hat there in the center at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg. Made from original glass plate negative at the National Archives. It was unidentified for 55 years until 1952, when Josephine Cobb recognized, I believe she was maybe a librarian there or an archivist, Lincoln in the image. To Lincoln's left is bodyguard Ward Hill Lamont. To his far left, and you can't even see it in this picture, is Governor Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania. This photograph is estimated to be taken just about noontime, just after Lincoln arrived, before Edward Everett's arrival, and about 3 hours before Lincoln gives his famous Gettysburg Address. The Library of Congress notes that the photograph is a reprint of a small detail of a photo showing the crowd gathering for the dedication ceremony there. at the cemetery where Lincoln gave his famous speech. Lincoln is visible facing the crowd, not wearing a hat, about an inch below the third flag from the left. Josephine Cobb first found Lincoln's face while working with a glass plate negative at the National Archives in 1952. And there's another little close-up. Lincoln, that's what we've all thought since 1952. But wait, there's somebody that thinks differently. And I know you can barely see him, but this is a blow up of this picture that this person believes is Lincoln in the crowd. And I'll tell you about him with his hat on. So it totally blows out of the water, supposedly, what we thought was Lincoln. Neither one of them is very clear. Some people that work in Civil War era photography, including, I believe, William Frazanito, does not believe that is Lincoln. So I am not an expert, so I cannot tell you, but I'll tell you this much. Christopher Oakley, you're going to hear his name again. He's a associate professor of new media at UNC Asheville, and he's a Civil War buff, which I hate the word buff, but is proposing a new location, by the way, for the speaker's platform. He already proposed that wasn't Lincoln. Now he has one for the platform, which we traditionally thought was over the fence in Evergreen Cemetery. There wasn't the fence then. Oakley's research indicates that the speaker's platform straddled both cemeteries and that Lincoln delivered his speech well within the Gettysburg National Cemetery's border for the past 4 decades. The scholarship has placed the speaker's platform and therefore Lincoln entirely within the Evergreen Cemetery. Oakley shared an interview at the Library of Congress blog. My research reveals that the speaker's platform straddled both and that Lincoln stood in the Soldiers' National. So for the first time in 40 years, Lincoln is back to where he's supposed to be, standing near the graves of the fallen soldiers. There are 6 well-known photographs taken by 3 photographers from 4 different vantage points, and they're all wide shots of the scene, but none depict the actual speech. The wide shots contain several landmarks: a flagpole, a poplar tree, a tent, and the speaker's platform. And there were trees there that witnessed this speech as well, which is a tiny blurry hump with people on the horizon. By merging analysis of the photos with the computer graphics program Maya, Oakley was able to line up the landmarks and establish the precise locations, he says, of the camera and triangulate the location of the platform. Oakley says his research discovered that the speaker's platform was not a 12 by 20 foot rectangle as always believed, but a much larger trapezoid. There were 39 people on the platform. There's no way they could have fit on all that small of a platform, said Oakley. I believe they were seated orchestra style in semicircular rows. And most important, the place where the speaker stood was on the National Cemetery side. And guess what? And that is from a public service their website, North Carolina. People don't agree on this. I think this guy has done a lot of animation. So I don't know if we'll ever have a definitive answer unless more pictures are uncovered. So that's all interesting, but I think what's more important is that Lincoln was there. He shows up even though he was invited as an afterthought. And this is a New York Times article from 2022. Lincoln stood on hallowed ground, but where? So first of all, Oakley decides that there's somebody different, and I'm not being sarcastic here, in the crowd that's Lincoln. And then he decides that the platform was a different shape and in a different place. So I'll leave it to you, do some more research. And here is where you look across and you think, I think it's not very far from where the only civilian that was killed, Jenny Wade, is supposed to be where Lincoln was speaking from. At least we thought so originally. And there's a sign in the cemetery that talks about Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address there. And there are all signs. There's poetry, different phrases of some prose poetry that talk about topics related to battle on different signage there. And here's the order of the procession. Here's the program. The National Cemetery. It tells you the order, and you can see in bold the President of the United States. And they will form in Gettysburg at 9 o'clock on Carlisle Street. Well, guess what? They didn't even get going that fast. And it tells what's going to happen. And the exercises will take place as soon as military and civic bodies are in position as follows: music, prayer, music, oration, music, president, dirge, benediction. After the benediction, the procession will be dismissed, and the state marshals and special aid to Chief Marshal will form on Baltimore Street and return to the courthouse in Gettysburg, where a meeting of the marshals will be held. When I read this, music by Dirk Field's band, prayer by Reverend T.H. Stockton, Doctor of Divinity, and they said that he spoke so long, it was like he was giving a speech himself. Music by the Marine Band, oration by Edward Everett. He spoke 13,607 words, spoke for 2 hours, but people used to be enthralled by his speaking and related its events in the war to previous wars and events. And by the way, could everybody hear Everett and Lincoln? Though some people tried to claim they could. No, they didn't. But for some of them, even though they couldn't hear, it was enough that they were there. Then there was more music, a hymn composed by Benjamin Brown French. And then it says a full view of the battlefield with the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance was spread before us, and all about were traces of the fierce conflict. Rifle pits, cut and scarred trees, broken fences, pieces of artillery, boxes, shoes, and caps were seen on every side, a great showing for relic hunters. So everything is not cleared up yet, as you can see. The Baltimore Glee Clubs then sang an ode written for the occasion by Commissioner B.B. French of Washington, and then Lincoln arose. Now they're waiting all this time. They're finally going to get to hear Lincoln. Dedicatory remarks by the President of the United States, a dirge, sounds uplifting, us, sung by a choir, and then the benediction by a different minister. Lincoln took but a few minutes for the address at the cemetery at Gettysburg. Boston reporter Charles Hale took down the slow-spoken words of the president. And here is Lincoln. And it's important to remember that somebody else believed they took down the words of the president. And I'll tell you why in a couple minutes here. And there he is on the platform. So realize they don't have a PA system going here. And I'll talk a little bit about the Gettysburg Address. So let me, here it is. I'm going to talk about it more, but I'll just say that he talks for about 2 minutes when he gives the Gettysburg Address. And not everybody loved it, but some people did. Nothing about this speech is agreed upon either. Remember, somebody's saying they took down the words. So we will get back to the Gettysburg Address. So he speaks for 2 minutes. Then he returns to the Wills house for dinner about 3 p.m. And the president interacted with numerous citizens after dinner. Wills placed the president by the front door facing York Street. Visitors entered the door, shook hands with Lincoln, continued through Wills' office to the side door where they could shake Governor Curtin's hand before exiting to the square. And that's their house. And here's some feedback about the president's speech, which nobody is going to agree on. Lincoln did not read his speech. I just like these signs when I saw them in the museum. I had lots of pictures from other times. I thought, oh, this would be neat to put in my presentation. So this is from Beyond the Battle Museum. It said Lincoln did not read his speech, but spoke loud and clear and very distinctly. And that was Sarah Ann Cook, age 19, of Bendersville. It was the face I saw, deep lined, earnestly sad, deep lined, earnestly thoughtful. It was the spirit of the man I seemed to see. And that was Gates Fahrenstock, age 10, which is pretty deep for a little one. He looked sadly over the cemetery and after a pause began his famous speech in a sad voice, entirely devoid of the oratorical zeal and fire which had characterized Mr. Everett's address. And this is William Tipton, 13 years old. And I think this is the last one I have. I was too young to judge the character of his speech, but what impressed me most with its delivery, the words seemed to come from the soul of the man, from a heart torn by anguish. Well, this man had known personal and public anguish. As you know, he lost children. He has a war that's not ending. He knew anguish. And these are from the Gettysburg National Military Park Museum. A perfect gem. The dedicatory remarks by the President Lincoln will live among the annals of men. That's the Chicago Tribune. His little speech is a perfect gem, deep in feeling, compact in thought and expression, and tasteful and elegant in every word and comma. And that's from a Springfield, Massachusetts paper. And then this is, I doubt that our nation's national literature contains a finer gem than that little speech at the Gettysburg celebration. Horace Greeley, go West, young man, that guy, editor of the New York Tribune, but not everybody agreed. But by the way, I wanted to show you this. This is the program that I showed you earlier, except this is at the Beyond the Battle Museum. It said, against all odds, this rare original program from the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in 1863 has survived. Few people at the time appreciated the significance of the event, and the document was used as scrap paper. See all the writing on it? I know it has reflection on it, but that tickled me. Of the 5 known manuscript copies of the Gettysburg Address, all handwritten by the president, the Library of Congress has 2. President Lincoln gave one of these to each of his private secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay, which are held by the Library of Congress. The other 3 copies of the address were written by Lincoln for charitable reasons after November 19th. The copy that Edward Everett requested, the orator who spoke at Gettysburg, is at the Illinois State Historical Library in Springfield. The Bancroft copy, requested by historian George Bancroft, is at Cornell University, the only one privately held. And the Bliss copy was made for Colonel Alexander Bliss, Bancroft's stepson, is now in the Lincoln Room. So versions of the Gettysburg Address, and which one is the one that he spoke? Which one did he actually say? 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We are met to dedicate a portion of it as the final resting place of those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, and we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who have struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it will never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work that they have thus so far nobly carried on. It is rather for us here to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take the increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. And somebody asked me, did he write the 5 copies? He hand wrote each copy. 2 were written before the battle, 3 after the ceremony at the cemetery. 3 were written after, but they are all written in his hand. The first one is partially in pen and partially on paper. There's 5 unique copies, Each one has, just looking at my notes here, a different spelling, punctuation, capitalization, and word choice, but each retains the same basic meaning. In all 5 copies, Lincoln begins by acknowledging the founding fathers and the nation's commitment to democracy. All that's the same. The 5 drafts are named after the individuals. The Nicolay copy is called the first draft, and it's named for his private secretary. And scholars believe he wrote it either before or during his trip to Gettysburg, but disagree whether it served as the copy that Lincoln read from. Years after the war, Nicolay affirmed this copy to be the earliest in existence. It was written in ink on executive action stationery and partially in pencil on lined paper. He allegedly kept the draft in his possession until his death in 1901, when it passed to his friend and fellow Lincoln secretary John Hay. The Hay copy, which was another one written, the second draft differs slightly from Nicolay. It bears revisions in the president's penmanship made on the morning of the speech or the president's return to Washington. We're not quite sure. Some historians speculate that the president delivered this version of the address on November 19th because of its similarities to the Associated Press transcription of the speech transmitted from the dedication by reporter John Gilbert. John Hay retained this manuscript as well as the Nicolay draft until his death in 1905, and his descendants entrusted both copies to the Library of Congress. So some people believe it's the Nicolay version, some people believe it's the Hay version, but it's one of those two. And even then, could he have veered? People sometimes become spontaneous. He authors 3 different copies following the cemetery dedication. As the ceremony's keynote speaker, Everett began collecting the dedication speeches into a collection. He requested the Gettysburg Address from the president, and Lincoln sent him a copy in 1864. And Everett says that he's going to sell the collection of speeches and donate the earnings to benefit soldiers stricken by illness. And by the way, that's the Nicolay copy there. But that doesn't happen, by the way. That same year, Lincoln wrote the Bancroft copy at the behest of the historian and former Secretary of the Navy, George Bancroft, who planned to incorporate the speech in his work, Autograph Leaves of Our Country's Authors. But because the president used both sides of the paper on his version, it was very difficult to distribute. He permitted Bancroft to keep the copy. It remained in the Bancroft family for decades until they sold it to a person who donated it to Cornell University in 1949. The Bancroft copy is the only draft written by Lincoln to remain in private hands. Since his 4th copy was basically useless because he wrote on both sides, Lincoln wrote a 5th draft known as the Bliss copy, named for Alexander Bliss and his stepson and publisher of Autograph Leaves. This draft is the only one to bear Lincoln's personal signature. It's the one in the Lincoln Room of the White House. No other copies of the Gettysburg Address are known to exist. The Bliss copy, the last one, became the most widely distributed, partly due to the care with which Lincoln wrote it. Very neatly, former Cuban ambassador to United States, Oscar Sintas, purchased the Bliss copy in 1949. However, he had donated the document to the people of the United States in his will following the Cuban Revolution, and specifically instructed that it be displayed in the White House. It is now displayed in the Lincoln Room of the White House, is inscribed on the great south wall of the Lincoln Memorial. And if you have seen it, it always moves me. It makes me cry seeing Lincoln sitting there. While the 5 drafts have different styles and rhetorical variations, their grammatical and structural differences are minimal. One marked distinction between the 1863 drafts and the following copies is Lincoln's usage of the phrase "under God." The Hay and Nicolay copies do not contain the phrase, while the latter 3 versions do. While some scholars maintain the president likely did not utter the words "under God" during his delivery, 3 correspondents, 3 different ones at the cemetery dedication, included the phrase in their telegraph reports of the speech on November 19th, which I believe he probably went off script at that point and added it. And some believe he just went on, basically spontaneously inserted the phrase. Some people tell a story that an American author said her name is Mary Raymond Shipman Andrews, popularized the notion that Lincoln scribbled the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope, one of the most perfect speeches ever given. Somehow I doubt it, when he was on the train. And she wrote that in her 1906 book, The Perfect Tribute. However, the existing Nicolay and Hay copies reveal that Andrews' tale is a myth. The president's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, did not begin a search for the original documents until 1908, 2 years after Andrews published her book. His search uncovered both the Hay and Nicolay copies in the possession of John Hay, therefore debunking the story about him writing it on the back of an envelope. And even Harriet Beecher Stowe claimed that the president wrote the speech in only a few moments. And Andrew Carnegie said that he gave Lincoln the pen to write it with. And that copy right there is half pen, half pencil. Regardless, what he said those days is a hallmark of his presidency and our identity as a country. While his true words during the cemetery dedication that day are a bit of a mystery, though. I mean, we know the essence of what he said. There might have been a word or two different. The 5 drafts show his thoughts and rhetorical skills. The differences of the 5 manuscripts do not shroud the significance of the speech or obscure the president's ability to reconcile the nation's great sacrifice and the meaning of the Civil War. And one other thing I wanted to say. The most striking difference is that it says under God. Lincoln's trip to the battlefield that morning, the large crowd, and the mournful nature of his prior remarks and musical numbers probably added to Lincoln's sorrow and led him to add God to his speech. Mary Lincoln, after the war, noted that Lincoln became more spiritual as the result of the loss of his son and his trip to Gettysburg. She related that her husband, while was not a technical Christian, had no hope and no faith in the usual acceptance of those words. He never joined a church. Yet about the time he went to Gettysburg, Lincoln felt religious more than ever. So I believe he added it. And thus this comes from the book, Lincoln Comes to Gettysburg, which I urge you to read, by Bradley and Linda Gottfried. And here it is, silly remarks. What did people say after? Well, I told you some people praised it, but then it said, the cheeks of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, and dishwatery remarks of the man who has to be pointed out as the President of the United States, the Chicago Tribune. The ceremony was rendered ludicrous by some of the sallies of that poor President Lincoln. Anything more dull and commonplace, it would not be easy to produce. We pass, and that's the London Times, and this is at the military park. We pass over the silly remarks of the president for the credit of the nation. We are willing that the veil of oblivion shall be dropped over them, and that they shall be no more repeated or thought of. Well, it's one of the most quoted speeches ever. And by the way, Lincoln also has a beautiful second inaugural address that you might want to read. And here's the book that Everett said he's going to assemble all these things and sell them. By the way, he never did raise that money. It has the speech from Lincoln. It has his speech in it. Lots of maps of the battlefield, and it was published, and that's from Wikipedia. And since I've been there to Gettysburg, I think this was put up maybe 2012. This is in front of the Gettysburg Library. It was a terrible job. I hopped out. We didn't have a parking space, and I was in a hurry, so it's a little dark. The Gettysburg Address is on there. And I think the reason they chose that location is because right there to the right, you can see a little piece of it, is the church where Lincoln will go. What does he do after the ceremony? Well, after the ceremony, Lincoln returned to the Wills house, had a late lunch, that public reception where he greeted people, and then he met John Burns. John Burns was the only civilian. He got his weapon, and he's going to go fight with the men. And he meets John Burns. He's quite elderly. When he was elderly that summer when he joined up fighting against the rebels there. And they walked down the street to the church, which again is very close by. It's the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church. And there's going to be a speech by the Lieutenant Governor of Ohio. And this is the church. It actually was torn down. And then they tried to recreate the approximate place where Lincoln sits in his pew at the service. So it's not the actual pew that he sat in. And there's something about the Gettysburg Address out front of that. And I did take that picture there. And there's an old postcard. And at 5 p.m., after delivering it, President Lincoln attended a patriotic meeting in this church. He was accompanied by John Burns. The location of the original pew is marked by a plaque. The current church building was erected in 1963, reusing the original rafters and artifacts from the building it replaced. And there's all kinds of stories. Is he tired? Does he fall asleep? Nod off, or does he pay attention? He doesn't even get to stay to the end because he has to go catch his train. But by the way, because we're not even exact on the time, some people say it's 24 hours, some people say it's 25 hours that he's there. Now, why did I put this? This is at like the Lincoln, this is just like a little thing right near our hotel where we were, dedicated the memory of Abraham Lincoln. Across from the railroad station, there's a Lincoln Diner. In the square of the diamond, as we called it, there's a Lincoln Hotel. There's so much Lincoln there. People discover Lincoln there, and they also feel the spirits of the men who died there. At least in my opinion, that's what happened. So there's lots of things with the Lincoln name on it. And I thought I'd just show you one of the more random ones. And I took this that morning. You saw me here, I'm in front of it. But there's Lincoln, and people, like they do with our statues here, they love to get their picture taken with Lincoln. Some people, it's a great photo opportunity. So here I'm doing an embarrassing touristy thing with my husband a few years ago. And here we are with Abraham Lincoln. If you have not been to Gettysburg, you need to go. Discover Lincoln there, discover the men and the women, the nurses that were there. As well. And then go to DC and discover Lincoln some more. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. If you ever want to help support financially Edison Ford, please go ahead, and that's our address. Thank you. And there is the Lincoln Memorial. And yes, I will cry when I see it. And there's my sites there. I thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next month.